Hey everybody, welcome to Dreamframer Photography. In today's video, I'm gonna show you how to apply split toning on your images. Split toning is very popular these days, and it's one of the reasons why Instagram images have that specific look. Actually, many people, when they see an image with split toning applied, immediately assume some Instagram filter was used. So let's learn how to do that in Photoshop. Before we open our image in Photoshop, let's learn something about complementary colors. What we have here is called Color Calculator. Color Calculator contains so-called color wheel on the left side, and this color wheel will show us all the colors the screen is capable of reproducing. These two little points show us complementary or opposite colors. That's because we clicked this button here. When we click this button, we will see these two control points in the color wheel, and they will always be on the opposite side of the wheel. So if we try to move one of these points, the other point will move in the opposite side. And as you can see in those squares under the wheel, the colors are changing, and you always have here two complementary or opposite colors. So this is the blue color, and we have the orange from the opposite control point. These complementary colors are something that we are going to be using in this tutorial. Now there is something I want you to remember. A circle has 360 degrees, which means that half of a circle is 180 degrees. These two dots are obviously on the opposite side of a circle, which means they are basically 180 degrees apart. This number, 180, is important to remember when you are searching for complementary or the opposite color of your chosen color. Because in Photoshop we don't have this color wheel, we have just one line, like a spectrum. You would have to add 180 to your chosen color to find its complementary or the opposite color. I'm gonna show you that on an example, so don't worry about that now. Let me open our picture so we can start working on it. I'm gonna import the image into Camera Raw filter by clicking on Filter and then Camera Raw. And in Camera Raw, we have a tab called Split Toning. When we click on that tab, we're gonna access Split Toning options. The tab is right here. In this tab, we have two sections. We have a section for highlights and section for shadows. Both sections look the same. They have the same kind of sliders. The top slider in both sections is Hue. This is where you decide about your colors, how you're going to tone your shadows, and how you're going to tone your highlights. This is where we apply that 180 degrees rule. We also have these saturation sliders. They decide about how much of the effect is going to be applied. So let me show you how this works. I'm going to choose a nice warm color for highlights. Let's say this one, and the hue for this color we are going to set to 50. To find the complementary color for shadows, we're going to add 180 to 50, and we're going to get to 130. Because we already moved saturation sliders, we already toned our shadows and highlights with complementary colors. This middle slider is used to move the balance between highlights and shadows, so we can have more of the warm colors or more of the cool colors. We can also do the opposite. We can change the hue for highlights and make them cool and make shadows warm. Or we can even choose different colors that are not complementary colors and just tone shadows and highlights any way we want. So this was the first method of creating a split-toned image in Photoshop. What's bad about it is that when you do it, it's done. You can't easily change the colors later and play with it a lot. Let's go back to Photoshop so I can show you how we choose complementary colors in Photoshop. I'm gonna double-click here to bring up the color picker. And as I mentioned before, we don't have a color wheel, we have a spectrum. And you can see that we have red on the bottom, and we also have red on the top. This is like unwrapped color wheel. Look at it like that. So, for example, red color has a hue 0. As you're moving up, you are moving the number for the hue up to 360, which is the full circle. And then after 360, you have 0 again. So if you move this slider to the bottom, you're gonna see that the number for the hue is 0, right? And then if you move the slider up, you're gonna come to the 0 again, right? So pay attention to that, please. Pay attention to the number for the hue. Let's say I want to choose red color for highlights. Our red color has hue 0. To find the complementary color, I'll have to add 180 to 0, which gives us 180, right? So we are trying to find this cyan color. I'm gonna type it because it's hard with the mouse. And that's basically how we choose complementary colors in Photoshop. Now when we know this, let me show you the second way of creating a split-toned image. For a start, as usual, I'm gonna copy our background layer and create a new layer. I'm gonna do that by dragging it down to a new layer icon. This way, we're gonna create a new layer and we are gonna be working in this layer. What I want to add is one adjustment layer, and that adjustment layer will be curves layer. When I click on adjustment layer icon, I'm gonna go to curves and click on curves. When I do that, this panel opens, and in this panel we have options for curves layer. Now remember, what we want to do is we want to tone, highlights, and shadows in complementary colors. In this panel, we have this section here that says RGB. Instead of RGB, which stands for red, green, and blue, we are going to click on that and choose only blue, for example. When we do that, we're going to see the graph for the blue channel. The right side of the graph represents how much of blue there is in highlights. We want to decrease, let's say, blue in highlights, which will automatically add yellow, because yellow is complementary color for blue. The left side of the graph represents shadows and how much of blue there is in the shadows. We can increase blue in the shadows and decrease blue in the highlights, and that will automatically do the opposite thing with its complementary yellow color. Let's grab this control point and add some blue to the shadows. And look at the image. I'm gonna pull it up quite a lot so you can see. So you can probably notice that shadows are toned more blue than highlights when I do that. So I think this is enough. I'm gonna grab the right control point, which is right here, and pull it down, because that way we're gonna decrease blue in highlights, which will automatically add yellow in the highlights. Now look at the image. Do you see how shadows are toned blue and highlights are turned yellow? If I click on this eyeball here, I'm gonna switch off the visibility for the layer so we can see how it was before. Now we don't see the effect. See? But if I click on the eyeball again, on this box actually again, we're gonna see shadows that are more blue and highlights that are more yellow. See that? The image already has a different feeling to it, right? You can also do the opposite. You can grab this control point and move it to the right. That way you're gonna add yellow to the shadows, like this. See the shadows? They are so warm now. And you can move this control point to the left and add blue to highlights. Let's see before and after. It's a slight difference, but you can see the difference, right? So let's reset blue channel completely and go to, let's say, green channel. You can do the same with the green channel. Let's add green to the shadows, like this. And let's add red to the highlights. You see the image now? Before and after. Of course, you don't have to add this much, just a little bit. What you can also do is you can add some contrast to this layer, to the whole image basically. To do that, because this is a curves layer, we have to add a couple of control points. I'm going to show you how to do that. So let's switch off the visibility. This is before, this is the result. The result has less contrast, right? To increase the contrast, I'm going to create a couple of control points more on this line. I can click here in the highlights area and bring that a little bit up, and click on the left side where the shadows are and bring them a little bit down. So now we have more contrast in the final result. You can play with this and add more or less contrast, of course. So now I'm gonna reset green again, and I'm gonna open red channel. We can do the same with the red channel. We can add some reds to the shadows and take reds out from the highlights, or do the opposite. Let's move now to the third method of split toning in Photoshop. I'm gonna delete this layer by dragging it down to a trash can, and this time I want to add a different adjustment layer. As before, to add an adjustment layer, we have to click down on the adjustment layer icon. And from this menu, I'm gonna add a solid color layer. We can basically choose any color, but let's say I want to try with this one, this blue color. Now, of course, because we have a top layer that is a solid color layer, we only see a blue color. But this box here shows us the blending mode for this layer. Right now, blending mode is normal, which is default, and we have to change that to exclusion. If I do that, shadows will automatically be toned blue, and highlights will be automatically toned in the opposite or complementary yellow color. That's because exclusion blending mode does exactly that. To learn more about blending modes, I created a couple of tutorials, and they're linked in the description of this video, or you can click on the card that showed up on the screen now. So this is basically a two-click way to create a split-toned image. Now, how do you adjust the strength of this effect? It's pretty easy. You double-click on the thumbnail for the layer, solid color layer, and let's say we want to choose the same hue, but we want to change the darkness of the color. The darker you go, the less of the effect you're gonna have. When you go to the black color, there will be no split toning whatsoever. If you go all the way to the top, you will have a lot of it. So this is how you basically decide how strong split toning will be using this method, of course. Then you can also change the hue and then change the tone of that hue. The thing about this method is, as before with curves, you always have complementary colors in highlights and shadows. So you can't really choose colors that are not complementary. You'll always have shadows and highlights toned in complementary colors. The good thing about these two methods is that they are non-destructive. You can just erase the top layer or change it and the result will be different. It's not like using Camera Raw. When we used Camera Raw, what we did there was a final result. Basically, what's done in Camera Raw and imported into Photoshop cannot be changed or reverted later. Let's move to the fourth method of split toning. The fourth method involves another kind of adjustment layer. That adjustment layer is called gradient map. So let me click on the adjustment layer icon and add a gradient map. Where are you? Where are you? Ah, right here. Okay. So when I click on that, the image will suddenly look very different, and we will have this panel here with the gradient. If I click on that, we will see that we can choose many gradients, like presets. So just to remind you, this panel here is related to our top layer. So let me click on the gradient again. I have many gradients here, but if you don't, you just click on this gear icon here and add new sets of gradients. These are all presets. You can also create your own gradient if you want to. By saying you can create your own gradient, I don't mean always that you have to create a gradient from scratch. You can just change the preset gradient. The best gradients for split toning are gradients with two colors, like this red and green, for example, or cyan and orange. You can also use these other gradients with more colors to get some interesting results, but that's not a typical split toning. So for this tutorial, we're gonna stick to gradients with 2 colors only. This is a nice gradient, for example. Let's see what else we can use. Not this one. This one, for example, purple and orange. That's a nice one too. So here, you can see that highlights are toned orange and shadows are toned purple. To change the colors, this purple and orange, you can click one of these sliders here and you can move them as well. So if you click on that and then you go down here and click here, you can change the color for shadows. Now we have blue shadows and orange highlights. If you click on the orange slider, you can move it, let's say, to yellow and create something like this, where highlights are toned yellow and shadows are toned blue. You can also add more of the highlights by dragging this slider to the left. Or, for example, you can add more shadows by dragging the left slider to the right. For now, let's keep it here at the ends of this gradient, and I'm gonna click OK. And now I have to change the blending mode for this layer from normal to, let's say, soft light. There you go. We have a nicely toned image where shadows are bluish and highlights are yellow. Soft light blending mode also adds some contrast, and you can decrease the effect by dragging this slider, the opacity slider, to the left. See that? To see before and after, I'm going to click here. Before and after. Because this is adjustment layer, I can double click on it and change the gradient. You see all these different results. You can imagine how many combinations we can create like this. If you want to add some more contrast, you can change the blending mode from soft light to, let's say, overlay. And there you go, you have more contrast. You can also decrease the effect if you drag opacity slider to the left. This method also has some flexibility, unlike the first method with Camera Raw. You can change the gradient, you can change the way the highlights and shadows are represented, like this. Of course, this is too much, so this is just an example, but let me go back to soft light to soften the situation a little bit and decrease the opacity. So something like this would work fine, if you ask me. Before and after. Okay, that was the 4th method. I'm gonna delete the top layer and show you the 5th method. The next 2 methods will give you some more flexibility, but they are also a bit more advanced. For the 5th method, I'm gonna add solid color adjustment layer. So I'm gonna click down here on the adjustment layer icon and choose solid color. This layer would be to color the shadows. So let's say we choose this blue color for it. I'm gonna click OK. And now I want to delete this layer mask. I'm gonna grab it and drag it down to the trash can. Confirm. So we're gonna use this layer for shadows. Let's name it shadows. This is just to better understand what's going on here. Shadows. Now we have to create a new layer, the one for the highlights. So I'm gonna click again down here, go to solid color, and choose some warm color for highlights. Something warm like this. Okay, that works fine. Okay. Let's delete the mask again. Confirm. And let's name this layer highlights. Now I'm gonna turn off the visibility for both these layers. They are here, but they are just not visible, okay? You see these 3 tabs here: channels, layers, and paths. Now we are in the layers tab, and most of the time we're gonna be here. However, we have this channels tab as well. If I click here, you're gonna see that we have the luminosity for red, green, and blue channels. And on the top, we have the composite RGB. I'm gonna click and hold Control on my PC or Command on Mac and click on RGB. That way, I selected only highlights. You can see that we have a lot of marching ants on our image, and they show you that we selected something on the image. It's not very obvious, but trust me on this, we selected highlights, and marching ants kind of show you something between the highlights and shadows, but they can't really represent what we selected because there is a lot of semi-transparency going on here, and that's going to become obvious when we move back to the layers palette. So if I click back on Layers tab, Photoshop will take us to the Layers palette. I'm gonna click here to turn on the visibility for our highlights layer, and I'm gonna click on a Layer Mask button. Look what happened. We added a layer mask, and the layer mask looks exactly like a black and white copy of our image. That's because we now applied our selection on the layer mask. And if you remember, we selected highlights. So wherever the layer mask is white or light color, we're gonna see our solid color layer. Wherever the mask is dark, the layer will be hidden. That's why we see a lot of yellow in the highlights on the image, and we don't see that much of it in the shadows. So this jacket is completely yellow, her face too. But we don't see that much here in the shadow. Okay, now we toned highlights on this image. We need to do kind of the same thing for shadows, but the mask needs to look inverted. That's gonna be very easy to do. We just need to copy this mask to the shadows layer. I'm gonna click Alt or Option on Mac and drag the mask down to this layer. So I'm clicking on Alt on my keyboard, clicking on the mask and dragging it down. This way we copied the mask to our shadows layer. But now we have to invert the mask. To invert the mask, we have to click Ctrl-I on PC or Command-I on Mac. Right now, both masks look the same, but if I invert this one like this, you can clearly see that now these two masks look like negative of each other. And if you take a look at our image, you're gonna see that our shadows are very blue and our highlights are very yellow. Now we have to change the blending mode for both these layers because this is obviously too much. It's too blue and too yellow. To do that, I'm gonna select both layers. I'm gonna click on Control or Command on the keyboard and click on this layer. So now when both layers are selected, I'm gonna change the blending mode from normal to, let's say, soft light. And voila. We have a very nicely toned image. This is before and this is after. Now we can play with this, we can change the opacity, we can change the colors for highlights and shadows separately. We can change the intensity for only shadows or only highlights. There is a lot of possibilities. For example, let's change highlights to orange and let's say hue 40, and 40 plus 180 is 220. So I'm gonna click OK. Let's change the shadows to 220 and click OK or enter, and that's it. Just to mention, you don't have to use exactly complementary colors for this. You can tone the image in different ways. You can use, for example, green and orange or blue and orange, but most of the times for split toning we use complementary colors. Now we have some green shadows and warm orange highlights. I'm going to delete both these layers and I'm going to show you the sixth method, which is done with color balance adjustment layer, this one, and something called applied image. In color balance panel, you can see that we can adjust tones for shadows, midtones, and highlights. So let's say I want to add some warmth to the highlights. I'm gonna click here and select highlights, and I'm gonna move this slider towards the yellow to add some yellow to these highlights, and I'm gonna move this slider to the right to add some red. Now we have nicely toned orange highlights. However, if you pay close attention, you're gonna notice that not only highlights are toned, some shadows are toned too, and how to protect these shadows, I'm gonna show you right now. Maybe you notice that whenever you open a new adjustment layer, the layer is open with its own layer mask, and the mask is already selected. You can see these white corners around the mask. If it's not selected, just click on it to select it and go to Image in the menu and Apply Image. Apply Image is very powerful and it could be used for various purposes. In our case, we're going to use it to adjust the layer mask for our layer. What it does, it basically applies the source image, which in our case is the original image. So this is the source image. This is our original layer, right? And applies that image to another layer or a mask. Let me show you how that works. We selected a mask, right? So Photoshop is taking the source image, our original image, this one here, and applies it to the mask. Since the mask was white, we basically have this black and white version of the original image applied on the mask. For blending mode, you want to keep to multiply and just click OK. When you do that, you're going to notice that now we toned highlights to that orange color that we chose, and shadows are basically the same. Look at the shadows, they don't change much, right? But highlights do change. Now we have to add another color balance layer for shadows. This time, instead of highlights, we're gonna choose either shadows or midtones. I'm gonna choose midtones because when you actually tone midtones, you also tone shadows. This time, I'm gonna drag this top slider to the left side to make the shadows more cyan, and drag this slider to the right to make them more blue. We're gonna select our mask again. It's actually already selected. And click on Image, Apply Image. But this time, we have to invert the mask, like before. To do that, I'm just gonna click on this Invert checkbox. And as you can see, the mask is already inverted. All the rest in this dialog stays the same. Blending mode is multiply, and I'm just gonna click OK. And you can see that our shadows are now kind of cool and highlights are warm. If I double click on this icon, I'm gonna be able to change the tone for shadows to something warm, for example, and also the tone for highlights to something cooler. And I could play with this all day long and create different results. If you learned something new from this video, press that like button, and if you have any questions, just leave them in the comment section down below and I'll answer. Also, subscribe to my channel, especially if you want to learn how to sell your photos online, because I made the most detailed guide on YouTube on how to do this. See you in the next video. Bye.